Welcome aboard, folks. I want to personally thank you for joining today's session, and I'm really looking forward to working with you here to get you certified around the Google Cloud platform. Today we'll be talking about the Cloud Architect Exam. This is going to be a very challenging exam for a lot of folks, and one of the things I'd like to go through is to give you some of the real areas you really need to focus on specifically, because this is not an exam unlike some other vendors that you memorize speeds and feeds, and this is not that kind of exam. There's a lot of design, a lot of migration, a lot of planning that you need to know, that even if you took a publicly available Google course, they don't cover, and that's just a plain fact of it. I took the beta, and I also took the released version of the exam, and I can tell you right now, if you go by what the class teaches you, you may not pass it. So let's buckle up and get you certified. Let's get going. Welcome aboard, folks. I want to personally thank you for joining today's session, and I'm really looking forward to working with you here to get you certified around the Google Cloud platform. Today we'll be talking about the Cloud Architect Exam. This is going to be a very challenging exam for a lot of folks, and one of the things I'd like to go through is to give you some of the real areas you really need to focus on specifically, because this is not an exam unlike some other vendors that you memorize speeds and feeds, and this is not that kind of exam. There's a lot of design, a lot of migration, a lot of planning that you need to know, that even if you took a publicly available Google course, they don't cover, and that's just a plain fact of it. I took the beta, and I also took the released version of the exam, and I can tell you right now, if you go by what the class teaches you, you may not pass it. So let's buckle up and get you certified. Welcome back, folks. Let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to go ahead and start covering the areas that we really want to see you focus on for this exam. Now, virtual machines is actually a pretty wide area, and what I would just like to point out is the way I'm going to be teaching the Google Cloud Platform Bootcamp, is going to be more modular. So I'm going to talk about Compute Engine, and then I'm going to go over to another module, and then we'll talk about Container Engine, and then the App Engine, as well as Cloud Functions specifically. So with that said, let's go ahead and understand a couple of things. So Google does offer several virtual machines. One of the challenges on the test that you're going to have, if you don't know what each of these are for, what the use cases are, is that you're going to be essentially presented case studies, but also scenarios that you're going to be asked to essentially design or provide a solution, architect, whatever you'd like to call it, how you are going to either migrate a virtual machine to the Google Cloud, or migrate a virtual machine from one zone to another or another region. You will also need to know as far as the areas that you may need to use the specific virtual machine. So essentially down here where it says use case. So again, I will cover this as much as I can in detail for you, more or less enough for you to be dangerous with it. But again, I'm not here to teach you everything about Compute Engine. So So here's the thing. With doing a boot camp, we do sort of expect you to generally have some kind of introductory knowledge to a degree. Now, again, you don't have to be an expert or anything, but it would be helpful if you did have an idea between compute engine and, let's say, container engine. Again, they're very different use cases, but not a big deal. We'll get you through it. This is, again, going to be part of a 16+ hour course to get you certified. So let's go ahead and continue on here. Now, when we talk about virtual machines, remember that some of Google's VMs are used for different purposes, as we saw on the previous slide. So when you take the test, you will get specifically challenged to make sure that you do understand what the Google Cloud solution is that you need to provide for an answer. So if you get a question, asking you about containers, then there's a pretty good chance that container engine would be the proper solution. But if you get a question around microservices, then of course that's a different story. So you need to look at, for example, cloud functions. So let's go ahead and finish up the slide. Then I want to go over to the dashboard, the console, and talk about a few things there to help give you an idea of some of the things you want to play with and make sure you understand before you go take the test. So App Engine is focused on platform as a service, and there's two modes. So with that said, there will be at least one question. I saw one question, at least from what I remember, trying to see if you knew the difference between App Engine versions. So basically, you have two different versions here: App Engine Standard and App Engine Flexible. Now, I've got modules that are going to cover each of these, so I don't want to, of course, cover too much into that. But I did want to, point out that you definitely need to check off each of these areas when you do take the test, and make sure that you do know before you take the test what each of the use cases are. So I think I sort of, harped on that enough, and I'm doing that for a reason, because just on this slide here, you're going to see 3 to 5 questions on this slide. So again, they're not going to ask you, like, for example, something simple. They're going to ask you in a scenario or a case study, what solution here would you use? And you'll need to correlate the request or the problem or the solution's architecture design requirements to what you're going to do on the Google Cloud Platform. Okay, so let's go over to the console here. And so now I'm in the Google Cloud Platform console. I don't know why, that's like a tongue twister for me, but it is. So anyway, so let's go ahead and go over to the dashboard. Now, if you take the GCP 100 course, you'll go through essentially all the features and functions of the dashboard at a high level. But the goal of course, this specific module is not to make you an expert in that. I do want to have you go to Compute Engine. Okay. Now, when you look at the console, again, this is fairly simple, fairly intuitive in a lot of respects. Now, when you're taking the exam, they don't really ask you questions about where to go in the console like, some other cloud vendors do. Most of the questions, as a matter of fact, pretty much all the questions are going to ask you, what solution do you need, or why do you need it? For example, if we're talking about VM instances, they're going to ask you, for example, we're going to go over to create instance. Again, they're not going to ask you questions about Compute Engine saying, what menu in the Compute Engine sidebar do you need to go to create a virtual machine? No, that's not the question. What they're going to ask you is going to be more focused around how you set up a VM, but they're not going to ask you where to go in the menu. They're going to definitely ask you about why would you set it up this way versus that way. So for example, the firewall. Now, you could set up a firewall when you choose to, whether it's now or later. But for example, if you do allow, for example, traffic, when you set this up, you need to understand, for example, if you go over here, that this is essentially blocking by default the traffic. So if you don't select this, and if you have, for example, a customer trying to access something inside the Google Cloud Platform and that's not selected, then of course it won't allow that traffic in. So do understand, for example, what the firewall does and why that's important. They do like to, of course, challenge you as far as, for example, startup scripts. There was at least one question. I don't remember if it was on the beta or on the released version. I did take both, so oddly enough, most of the questions are actually pretty similar. But as far as the exam, you need to look at, for example, when you do the practice run before you take the exam, I'm going to highly advise you to go to each of these pages, even if it's for a minute, to understand, what exactly you need to do to set up a specific area here. So for example, by default, you can go and change your zone. So by default, you need to go over here to settings. Now, again, if you did want to do that, you go to region and select that, and then select the zone that you want to be part of. So this is where you go save that. And you can see here, newly created resources will be deployed to that specific region and or zone. So again, just be aware of that. So another thing to pay attention to, I'm going to go back here because I forgot to do one thing, is this. So if you go over here to boot disk, now there's several different scenarios. So you go over here to OS images. So you could select the image, for example, that is basically the Google Cloud Platform provided, or you could go ahead and select, for example, an application image like SQL Server, a custom image. Now, you can see here that there's one already created. I created one for a test earlier. And then you could also create a boot disk from a snapshot as well. And then existing disks as well. But before you, for example, before you do any of this, what you have to do in the first place is if you need a custom image or if you need a specific boot disk, you have to go over here to create it first. So like images over here, you create the image over here. Snapshots, you create it there. And then disks, you would create it over here. Okay, so I think we got that. Again, you don't need to know where you go to do stuff in the menu. That was one of the refreshing things I thought, because it's not like it's a Windows exam where you need to know, do I go here, do I go here, and then I click here, and then I click here. That's not the goal. So I'm going to go back to VM instances. What I'd like to make sure you get, and this was a tricky part on the exam, at least for me, because if you don't read the documentation beforehand, some of this stuff actually is not in the class. So again, if you don't do this or practice it, then you may not understand what they're asking on the test. When you go over here to import VM, you see here, import a VM with Cloud Endure? Well, you know, I can tell you right now, they don't talk about Cloud Endure. So you're like, well, what is Cloud Endure? So basically here, Cloud Endure is a VM migration service. So again, if you haven't played around in the import VM menu, then when you take the test and they talk about Cloud Endure, you're sort of like looking like with a deer with you know, a deer in the headlights, as we Yankees like to say. So anyway, so just pay attention to Cloud Endure. So if you go here to continue, what's going to happen, you'll see that it's going to bring up this sign-in service. So what you have to do is you have to sign in with your Google account, and I would watch this so you could see. For time purposes, again, the goal of this is basically, this is an add-on service. That's what it is. It's not actually part of the Google Cloud per se. It's an add-on service. It's integrated, but this is a separate integration service that you could use. Okay, so another area is instance groups. So before I cover that, actually, let's go back to the PowerPoint. I want to cover a few things. Okay. Now, when you create a virtual machine, again, you can create a predefined or a custom VM. And so if you remember the dashboard that we just came from, you could see that when you select the VM template, it could be predefined, one of the GCP ones, for example, an App Engine one, whatever, or a custom one. Another area on the test that you may see a question on, again, I wouldn't spend a lot of time on this to memorize too much about the pricing, but you may want to know what a preemptible instance is. Again, it lives 24 hours at most. So preemptible means that it could be shut down at any time. In other words, it's not reserved, it's not guaranteed, it's going to shut down, within a certain amount of time, based on what's going on in the Google Cloud, essentially, and some other variables, or if the machine's not being used, etc. So, but the billing, for example, is 10-minute minimum. So interestingly enough, you might want to know that on the test. And so do understand that if you get a scenario and they ask you, for example, if you spin up a VM and it's active, what is the minimum amount of time you build for, you would have an idea. That's like one of the few simple questions I saw. Another area is called the inferred instances. So this is sort of interesting because, again, there isn't too much in the documentation about it, at least initially. There is more now. And I actually was reading a very good blog post on it as well. So inferred instances means that, for example, if you have multiple VMs in that same zone, it'll combine them into a single charge, and then that helps increase your discount. So that's a pretty cool feature, and it does it automatically for you. Now, again, discounts with Google, basically, again, 10 minutes and thereafter you're billed every minute. Another area is going to be the storage. And again, before you create the VM, you'll need to create your storage. And we're going to go talk about that here in a second. Now, there's standard SSD or local SSD. So if you go over here, you could see, for example, maximum IOPS. And you could see that depending on what you're trying to do, you may or may not need to have an SSD. You may not need those IOPS. Just remember that if you do select something that is more read intensive or write intensive, you need to balance that, disk provisioning. So you don't want to, of course, pay for SSDs when you could just get away with the standard disk, for example. So common sense, but again, they're going to ask you, what type of disk you're going to use. So let's go back to the console, and I want to go over to disks and show you two things that you may want to look at. So you can see there that I have instances here. Now, go over here to create disk. And you could see that by default, it will create a name for you. And again, just one of the kludgy things about the naming, well, it's not kludgy. Just for me, for example, I really like to have a lot of caps and I like to have little wildcards, but that's just me. Again, there's a reason. So just pay attention to that. You could have up to 63 lowercase letters. Now here, if you go over here, you could see that there's two types of disks that you could choose from. And again, just before you take the test, I encourage you to at least go look at the console and understand some of the differences that'll pop up. Now here, you'll have the SSD and the standard disk that tells you the maximum disk size. And so if you go back here, and I'm doing this on purpose because you will see in a second, IOPS. Now, they're going to ask you a question. For example, when you create a virtual machine, what type of a disk you're going to need to attach to it based on the workload. So there's a couple case studies that are actually disclosed in the Google Cloud Architect Exam description, and you go ahead and check them out. But you'll want to look at those also, and I already showed those to you in the first module I had done, so you might want to take a look at that again. Now, again, so what you want to do, and I got the link here, you definitely want to look at the performance. Again, they want you to know what size disk or what type of disk you need to use in what situation. So for example, if you have a requirement for really high IOPS with low latency, you may need to use a local SSD. And the NVM and the SCSI, remember there's two, so if you go over here, one second, let me go ahead and get, I don't know what I have my pen there, but there it is. So if you go over here and you could see like the IOPS over here, if you get a question asking you about what type of disk you need to have the best IO possible, and if there is no requirements to have this like redundant between like zones or anything like that, because also too I'm going to cover some other things to look at when it comes to the disks that you might want to know. But again, you know, as far as knowing the difference here, this is a big deal in the tests. Like I said, you'll get a question or two just on making sure you understand the difference between a persistent disk and a local SSD. So there is a use case, of course, as you would expect, on why you may need to use a local SSD versus a standard disk, or a SSD persistent disk, that is. With that said, okay, let's go back here now. And you can see here that, again, you have the SSD persistent and the standard. So you have that there. Now, if you go over here to snapshot, you could then go and see the source right there. Now that was created early. Again, if you're designing basically a virtual machine and you don't set up the disk or the snapshots of the images, etc., then, you know, again, you know, it won't let you go past that. But again, just so that you see that. And then encryption, by default, it's automatic. Then you just go create. So it'll go ahead and spin that up. And then I would just want to go over to snapshots. And you can see that that's the snapshot that we just used. And then to create a snapshot. Now, one of the areas that you're going to get asked about in the test, I got a question about this. See where it says enable VSS. Well, make sure you know what VSS is. So basically, if you have for example, a volume and you have a database on it running on it, and you need to make a snapshot of it. You don't have to typically, basically instead of having to do a shutdown of that, you could go ahead and do a hot backup and not have to, worry about keying the database. So basically you need to enable VSS if that's the case. Now, of course, this is for Windows only, so just be aware of that. And then source disk over here. So very simple. Then you go over to images. And I'll go back to that actually after we go over to this area here. Okay. So virtual machine. So another area that you need to be really good at is trying to make sure, let me get my pen again, that you do know the difference between a global resource, a regional, and a zonal. Again, from Google's perspective, they think it's very important that you know the difference between all of these and what resources are global, which ones are regional, and which one would be zonal. So, for example, if you get a question about a disk image, can you move that around from one region to another? The answer is yes. However, if you get a question saying that you get a local SSD, for example, now local SSD, that sounds pretty simple to understand, but remember, they're going to ask you that in a way where you're reading this big scenario in most cases, and it's very easy to sort of skip over that and not totally think. And the reality is you may or may not be able to move that to another zone, so be aware of that. Snapshots are also global. So again, know this for the test. Networks are also global. Now, there is an external IP address. We talked about that in the virtual networking module earlier. So what are the protocols that are supported? Once again, you'll need to know these. Know TCP, UDP, and ICMP. Now, every virtual machine belongs to a network. And again, the default network is used if none is selected. Subnets. Now, there's essentially, subnets are fairly straightforward to understand, but I did want to point out, I don't know what's up with my pen here. Okay. So again, just know that there is auto and custom. Again, don't worry about that. And as far as the virtual machine access, so this is actually an area that most people will do pretty well in, because again, Google isn't doing anything that no one else is doing basically. So you do want to know, for example, there is a question on like what a bastion host and what you would use a bastion host for. So I do know that a bastion host is basically a jump off point to log into the cloud. And so basically, instead of having like 80 connections access the cloud, you go through essentially one instead, for example. Could be more than that, but just as an example I'm using. And again, you could access a virtual machine via SSH or in Windows via RDP, for example. PowerShell can be used. So again, I highlighted auto start for a reason. Now, auto start, for those that aren't familiar with what that means, basically the goal of auto start is that if you do have a failure, if the VM gets terminated, for example, it'll go ahead and bring up that VM and basically try to replace it. So basically it's going to launch another instance or another VM. Again, if you don't select auto start and if there is a failure or something happens to that virtual machine, it won't bring up another instance. So one of the best practices when you're designing a virtual machine infrastructure with Google Cloud Platform is to ensure that if you're going to do any kind of virtual machine mobility, you need to have that selected just as a baseline. So don't change the default. Now, why would you want to do that? Let's say, for example, you have a virtual machine that might not fit into, for example, a consistency group or something of that nature. But again, there's usually no good reason not to select that in most cases. Now, billing for using the virtual machine, using the network. Again, this is a little bit confusing, I think, to some people. So egress. Egress is what? This is where you leave the cloud, or essentially, actually as well, to another region as well. I was going to just say that a different way, but that's actually simpler. So again, you're not billed for going in, but you are billed for going out. And that's pretty common. Now, if the traffic is from one VM to another in that zone, then you're not charged. And you're also not charged to GCP services. Now, I'm spending a little bit of time on this because, again, you'll get questions and you're going to be asked to design a virtual machine infrastructure. And they're going to give you scenarios about what the customer wants. And you'll need to make sure that you design the virtual machine to be able to be migrated or to be able to minimize charges. So, for example, if a customer, doesn't want redundancy, then don't design that for redundancy. Just read the question because, again, it could catch you. So once you connect to an external IP, again, this is called a bastion host. And a bastion host is essentially, again, another way you connect to the cloud to minimize the connections, especially like if you're going to use SSH. You could easily scale out pretty quickly with SSH. So again, you don't want to do that if you need to. So another reason is you could also use this for NAT gateway as well. So you will see that on the exam. So don't be surprised by that. Now, there's 3 different ways to create a virtual machine. You could go to the console, you go to the command line, or you could use the REST API. Now, the simplest way is the console in most cases. Now, there will be times where you need to go to the command line to essentially create a virtual machine. So let's say you need to run some custom scripts or something, then you need to use G-Cloud to be able to do that. And then APIs, especially if you're going to use essentially like serverless applications or some kind of data collection processes, whatever it is. So let's go back to the console. Now that we talked about snapshots and VMs a little bit more, I wanted to go over here to create an image. So again, you need to get good at understanding how to create an image, a snapshot, and a disk. You don't need to memorize the steps, but you sure want to make sure you select the right type of VM from the choices you have. So again, you could use encryption. You go over here and family. So family is going to be typically a specific operating system like Debian or Red Hat or something. Then you create another image here. It says you can't. And again, if you do want to use a source disk, you go over here and it tells you the default, and that 10 gig is a default when you create an image. So with that said, that's all you want there. And then you could go ahead and use committed use discounts. Now again, this is based on a specific time frame. I am just using the free tier, or essentially the $300 credit, so I'm not going to be doing that. So again, let's go back up here. And if you go over to Compute Engine, you'll see that the VMs are listed here. And if we go down here to zones, so you could see that the zones are set up here. Now, before you do that, you need to understand how the zones and what zones are in each region. So understand that you have zones in this region here. For example, this is in this 3 zones in Europe West 2. US Central, there's 4. And again, you don't need to memorize that, but you'll get, again, you'll get a question that will tell you from this zone to this zone, and how would you set up that virtual machine, basically. So with that said, and then lastly, operations. This is again more for creating specific routines. This is more for the API. Quotas. You create quotas. Generally, on this exam, I didn't see too much on quotas, but what I did see was mainly anything. The question I did see is actually around auto scaling, but we're going to cover auto scale in a separate module because that's again, that's a little bit more than a 20-minute discussion. So let's go over to the PowerPoint. Now, when you create a VM, so we saw how to create a VM. It's not very hard. It takes less than a minute, especially if you're going to use the default configurations or a snapshot or something like that. Again, when you create an instance, you need to understand that the instance is going to use what's available in that zone. Now, let me get because I need to draw this out for you. Okay. So you could see over here, you've got Compute Engine over here, and these are different zones. And so again, if you need to replicate from here, let's say to here, this is all in this region here. And again, just be careful of, does these configs support this config over here and over here? And the question is you do need to look at the processors. Now, a managed instance group uses a template, and the template is very simple to create. And essentially the template is going to say the type of VMs, the type of operating systems, the config essentially. They do need to be identical instances. So for a managed virtual machine group, so if it's a managed instance group, all the configs need to be the same. Now, an unmanaged group does not. So that is a difference. Again, you'll get scenarios and you'll get diagrams to look at as well in some cases, and you need to look at how the configuration is set up. So the reason you want to have an instance group could be for migrations, aligning assets, like keeping them, visibly sane so you can understand where everything is and what it is, scaling, and then also recovering after failures. And there's 2 types. There's zonal and regional. Zonal is in the zone, of course, and regional is in the region. Now, you could move, of course, the zonals between the regions, but of course, again, regional is only in that region. But again, you can't again, move that instance group between regions at all either. So again, just be careful of that. So a managed instance group uses a template, so be aware of that. Another thing to think about is that this template is a global resource. So that is sort of cool, where that template, you could move it around from Asia over to North America if you so choose. Excuse me. And again, do you understand these little trivial little things? They do want you to know these things. Again, when you're doing this from the console, it's easy to figure out, but on the test, they want to make sure that you do understand the difference between the asset types. They seem to really like to make sure you know that. So by default, important, instances in the group will be placed in the default area and randomly assign IPs from the regional range. So basically, if you have an instance that is in a group, it'll be placed in the default zone essentially, and then it'll be assigned IPs from whatever zone or region that it's in. This is not worded well, that's my bad. So unmanaged groups are groups of dissimilar instances. So again, when I had said managed instance groups, they have to be similar. Unmanaged instance groups could be dissimilar. So again, be very careful of the configs they're going to give you and validate that they're similar. That should help mitigate you missing the difference between a correct answer and an incorrect answer. So why do you want to use an unmanaged group? Like for what reason? Generally, you only want to really use this if you need to load balance dissimilar instances. So for example, if you have an instance group with Debian Linux and Red Hat Linux, and the configs are totally different, of course, then, again, that's not going to be managed. So you need to understand, how are you going to load balance those. And you need to use what's called an unmanaged instance group. Now, a virtual machine, what does the image contain? So it's going to have a bootloader, an operating system, a file system structure, software, and customizations. Now, an image store could be a tar or gzip file. And the images are managed by the image service. So images and compute engine. Again, if it's public-based or usually from Google, could be a third-party vendor or a community, or it could be a premium image as well. Private and custom images, you're going to create a new image from typically a virtual machine, and you're going to go ahead and import it from like on-premises, a workstation, or another cloud. So, for example, if you get asked how would you import images from a customer site, again, you need to use what's called a custom image. VirtualBox or AWS, again, images can be stored in the cloud storage. Now, disks. So Compute Engine comes with a single root per persistent disk. Images loaded into the root disk during boot. So bootable means you get attached to a VM and boot from it. A snapshot is an incremental backup. Durable means that it could survive a termination. And then there is some software involved. Now, a persistent disk could be up to 64 terabytes. Pretty good size. So again, be aware of that. Okay, so disk options. So if you go over here, you will see disk options. Now, again, let me go get my handy dandy pen that disappears on me. And so you have persistent disk, and then you have the local. And again, I had stated earlier, you want to know the difference between the two, why you want it to. I'm repeating it for a reason because they have this fetish for these questions on that. I don't know why, but they do. Now, as far as I'm being sarcastic, because again, when you take an exam and it just seems like there's certain areas they just seem to want to prove to you, and again, it just seems sometimes, as someone that developed exams, it seems like they didn't really think some of this out well. That's just my thought. As far as a cloud persistent disk, so for example, if you have a single file system, you need to use a cloud persistent disk. You don't want to use a hardware disk. Again, you can't move that from, in other words, the hardware disk is going to be attached locally. And so you can't move that around from one machine to another. So be very careful with that. A cloud persistent disk, on the other hand, you can move around, you can make it grow, you could, build it up and build it down. So I have a note down here for a reason. A single file system gives the best performance on persistent disk. So basically, if you get a question, read the question and they're asking about a single file system and maybe what kind of a config you need to look at. I just told you, you need to know that for the test. Virtual machine snapshots. So a snapshot is not available for local SSD. So for example, if the disk is attached to the virtual machine you're using, you can't take a snapshot of it. You go ahead and create an incremental backup. Snapshots can be restored to a new persistent disk, and don't use that for database migration. Now, moving a virtual machine to an alternate zone. Again, they like questions like these. They want you to know this content. So the two ways to move this to support availability. So what are the two ways to support availability? It's manual, automatic. I think we get that. But again, don't use a virtual machine with a local SSD. When you're reading the question, pay attention to these things. They're going to throw all these different config stuff at you. And it's very easy to read about 7 different config variables and you're looking like, well, how do I put this together? Because, again, there's a lot there. So just pay attention. Select the answer you need to select. Okay. So that's about all for Compute Engine that I had. Now, I did have some questions that I want to go through to test your knowledge to see what you picked up and see how you might do on this area. So the first question is, you're looking at setting up additional storage for a single file system. What type of storage would be best for this? So the cloud persistent, right? Single file system, you always want to use a cloud persistent disk if you can. What is the minimum amount of time you're going to be charged for a virtual machine? It's 10 minutes. And that question there actually really should say Compute Engine virtual machine because the charges for container, etc. would be a little different as well. But in most cases, the charging is about the same, but there are some differences, especially like when you're talking about the other options. So that's what that should say. So that's my bad. Okay. What would be the proper IP schema based on the following scenario? So again, you're going to get a question that's going to give you a scenario like this, usually a little bit more complex than this, that you're going to need to understand what is being asked and pick out the best answer based on what you think Google thinks is the best answer. So an external IP address would be the proper solution for this. So if they need something dedicated, again, needs to be external essentially. And static, again, this is probably the best option. So another little scenario, again, they are looking for microservices. So if it's microservices, that should stick out in your head automatically. That is probably cloud functions. Your companies think about migrating their VMs and would like to ensure that they can migrate the virtual machines to any zone in the Google Cloud Platform. Customer would like to know if it's possible and why. So, absolutely, they could definitely migrate their images, because why? Those images are what? They're global resources. Now, if it's a zonal resource, then that, of course, you can't migrate globally. It stays in the zone. But because it is an image, and remember, images are global, you will be okay to migrate that. So you're looking at segmenting specific VM resources in a logical manner for ease of management. What subnet best practices when it comes to defining subnets would you want to use? So again, there's only two. There's autumn and custom. So do you understand what they are? Auto basically is automatic. Custom is where you have to create a specific configuration. And that's about all that I had. Good luck on the exam, and I hope to see another module here pretty shortly.